Hey humans, how's it going? Susan Ruth here. Thanks for listening to another episode of Hey Human Podcast. This is episode 444, and my guest is Austin Mao. Austin is the co-founder of Ceremonia, a non-profit entheogenic church in Colorado. I had to say that slowly so that I got it right. As a leader in legal and safe psilocybin, mushroom, and ayahuasca retreats, Ceremonia uses a synthesis of science and shamanism in partnership with plant medicine to guide people in spiritual, mental, and physical well-being. We had a great conversation. Austin's super fascinating, and I'm excited for you to hear this one. Check out Hey Human Podcast for links and to learn more about my guests in the show. Hey Human Podcast is on YouTube under Official Susan Ruth. I'm on Patreon at Susan Ruthism. My TikTok and Instagram is Susan Ruthism. Check out SusanRuth.com to learn more about me and my other artistic endeavors, and find my albums on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, wherever you get your music. Rate, review, and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast on Apple, iHeart, and Spotify podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening. Be well, be kind, be love. Here we go. Austin Mao, welcome to Hey Human.
Hey, Susan. Thank you.
I'm going to start asking where you're from originally and how growing up shaped you into the path that you're on now.
So I'm originally from Los Angeles, or a suburb from LA. My parents divorced when I was less than 1 year old. And I grew up primarily with my mom. So I run retreats, and I'm sure we're going to go into that. We run psychedelic retreats. One of the questions that we often pose people on the first night, just as a means of introduction, is like, what is the early childhood memory that most defines who you are today, or maybe most impacted who you are today? And for me, there's a memory of when I was around 8 years old, and my mom was broken down on the floor sobbing. And at that age, I had no idea why she was crying, only that she was in pain, and it was my responsibility to save her from that pain. And so I sang to her as a kid, trying to console her. And I think in that moment, there was this savior complex that was born in me, particularly directed towards the feminine, like wanting to help people in my life. But that was very much in the shadow for so much of my life. And where I gave that energy was from a place of altruism, from self-sacrifice. Sacrificing my energy.
Martyrdoms type?
Maybe you could say a little bit of that, but ultimately, there's this term in psychology called parentification, and it's this idea of that the child now has to take care of the parent, and that's really how I grew up. My father didn't have a high school education. He was like a poker dealer in a casino in Los Angeles, and I used to think that he loved money more than me. And in fact, the way that he would express his love to me is by giving me money as a kid. I grew up with this need to earn my father's love, while my mom raised me, giving me so much blessings and love, and I could do no wrong, and it was just complete positive reinforcement. So fast forward to my adult life, became a multi-time entrepreneur, really became good at not working, which meant that I was making, a high six-figure income, working 4 hours a week from anywhere in the world, culminating in having the largest Airbnb company in Las Vegas. We were hosting 2,000 guests a month. There were a portfolio of houses that I owned. And then I found plant medicine. Recently, I was in a speaker training because I gave a TED Talk, and we were asked to tell stories of who we were before, who we are now, etc. And what I learned there is that I couldn't really even use the stories from before I tried plant medicine in a ceremonial context, psychedelics in ceremonial context, because I had changed so fundamentally that it wasn't like I was writing a new chapter of my life. It was like a complete sequel to who I was. Your question is, how did my formative years make me who I am? It all kind of got wrapped up in what I do now, which is to say that now I am also devoting my life to helping people, but from a place of, I think, greater mindfulness and skillfulness than I used to, from a place of self-sacrifice and burning out. Now I'm doing it in a more, I think, considerate and tactful way.
When you were doing the Airbnbs and had that empire, which you still may have that empire, but back then, were you happy Or were you feeling like there was something missing?
It's funny. There's a spiritual teacher that you may know, Ram Dass, right?
Love me some Ram Dass.
Love you some Ram Dass, exactly. And he has this line that says, who are you in the privacy of your own heart? And someone else that kind of came up with him, Joseph Goldstein, gives the line, who are you when you're sitting on your toilet, right? Like, what are your most private thoughts during that time? So from the outside looking in, I was living a quote unquote Instagram life. I was humble bragging on Facebook and Instagram, the photos of cars and houses and travel and blah, blah, blah. But on the inside, I was rudderless. I did not have direction in my life. And there's this book that we have people read when they come through Ceremonia called The Second Mountain. And the author, David Brooks, distinguishes between happiness and joy. Happiness is this fleeting, like pop a bottle of champagne, win an award, do something good. Great. You're happy for a moment. But joy is something deep and pervasive, right? It's something that lasts much longer than the moment. And so I would say that I had many moments of happiness. And in fact, what I was doing was chasing happiness, like going to exotic destinations and whatnot. But I didn't have joy in my life. I didn't have purpose. I didn't have values systems, and I didn't have relationships that nourished me.
I often think of plant medicine as bringing us back to a place of remembering. I myself have not done ayahuasca. I've done mushrooms maybe 2 or 3 times. It worked once. The other 2 times, everything just got real sparkly. But I haven't done it in the sort of context of purpose, other than finding a moment of joy. But I do believe that plant medicine, considering the source of it, it's facilitating a way back to the truth of who we are instead of the idea of who we are.
Yeah, totally. I liken it to the feeling that maybe anyone has felt here, a feeling the most alive you've ever felt. So think like falling in love for the first time, or skiing down a mountain, or solving that problem or getting the big paycheck or something like that. The most alive you've ever felt, combined with the feeling of being home. Coming home with your dog wagging its tail after a long trip, and that feeling of, here I am. And that's they're like polarized, right? Like one has this extraordinarily exuberant energy, and another has this very relaxed energy. But imagine both of those combined. That's the feeling that people often feel or describe feeling when they come through, this experience. And it goes to show you, it provides what we call, in psychology, an index experience. It's like, oh, now I know what that feels like. Like, I know that's possible. Then you can start aiming your life like a compass towards that.
Did you experience plant medicine first and have it give you an epiphany and then move into these spaces? Or did you think, oh, this is an interesting thing to do, this sort of Ceremonia type scenario? And then how did those two things meet? Did you have to go through your own healing first, or were you healing along the way, I guess is more specific?
My consciousness journey, if I were to pinpoint when it began, it was about 8 years ago when I heard that my father was diagnosed with cancer. Mm-hmm. And I spent his last 6 months of his life bedside with him. In that time, I had been estranged from him. I would see him maybe once a year. And whenever we would talk, maybe once every month or 2 months over Skype or over FaceTime, it'd be a quick, hello, how are you doing? What'd you eat for dinner? How's life? Okay, great. A super short call. And I imagine that many of your listeners may have relationships with their parents that can be similar. That experience taught me something, because he learned what is truly valuable in life. That it's not the money that he hoarded. It's not the property. It's the love, the connection, the experiences that we have in life. So after he passed, I went through a deep grieving process. And it wasn't until 4 years after that I had my first ceremony experience. In that case, it was with ayahuasca. Now, when I sat with ayahuasca, I had already had over 100 psychedelic experiences, many years of Burning Man, festivals, camping trips, etc. I went in with a chip on my shoulder thinking, what could this possibly teach me that I haven't already seen? And I'll share with you because I just heard you say that you had some experiences and one worked, one didn't. Something like 12% of America uses psychedelics a year. A lot of people don't realize that. It's a very staggering number. And for those that have used a psychedelic, whether that be in college or whether that be therapeutically, whatever it is, the gap between normal waking consciousness and what you experience in a psychedelic is so big that it's already called ineffable, which means I literally couldn't explain to you in words in a way that you could understand it, right? The gap between recreational or solo use of psychedelics and a guided or therapeutic or ceremonial container is equally as big. And I had no idea about that. And so my first ayahuasca experience, in the first ceremony out of 3, I felt embraced by my mother and felt the warmth of her love to a capacity that I had never remembered feeling before. And it felt like divine. Then I had a vision of introducing my then wife to my father, who had passed years prior. And I didn't even know I was missing that in my life because, wow, like in the grieving process, of course, I grieved the memories that we had. I didn't know to grieve the unopened possibilities of the future, right? So I came out of that ceremony and I was like, hallelujah, I'm healed. I'm ready to go home. Where's my Uber? But there were still 2 more ceremonies. The next morning, we did a workshop and we were asked to recount an early childhood memory, very much like you just asked me. And I could barely pick out anything. It was a complete haze. So I went into that ceremony with the intention of investigating my memories. And I took a very large dose in this case, and I started reliving my memories in vivid detail, going back and back in time. I mean, I could remember turning my locker combination in high school, like flipping pages in a book and reading passages. Like you hear about photographic memory or you see movies of A Beautiful Mind or something like that, right? Like that was me living that experience. And I went back and back and back in time until I was a child under sheets. And then I felt horny. I popped up on my yoga mat in the middle of the jungle. There's 49 other, entrepreneurs and founders next to me. And I'm like, what the heck could this be? And when I went back in, I realized that I was sexually touched by my mother's boyfriend when I was 4 years old. And I had no idea. My mind had completely repressed it. And my mind threw the baby out with the bathwater because it repressed all memory. So then I started going forward in time in this vision with the new knowledge of not only the sexual trauma, but also the knowledge that my mind would repress long-term memory. And everything started making sense. Like I had sexual confusion as a kid, a bully as a kid, as a teenager. Just my relationship with the feminine and sexuality was so marred, so complex. And I couldn't hold on to relationships or even hobbies because I just would simply forget the beautiful memories that I would create within them. All the way to the present moment where I'm lying on this mat in the middle of the jungle. And I woke out of it with tears in my eyes. And I told the facilitator about this. And she says, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And I said, no, you don't understand. I feel like I was cured of Alzheimer's. So that ceremony heralded the beginning of the rest of my life, what I call the renaissance of my life. That was about 4.5 years ago. And since that time, I've been on an accelerated and extraordinary healing path, going deeper and deeper into myself to the place, and then being in service. If you look at every major spiritual tradition, they agree on certain things, whether it's Buddhism or Christianity or Hinduism or Islam. One of the things they agree on is that service is a path to a spiritual experience, the experience of self, of God. And where my healing path has taken me is to be deeply in service to the same path of healing that I took to find myself. And so my story that I'm sharing with you now, I've shared on stage to thousands of people. I've shared on the TED stage, but it's not unique because now I facilitated more than 500 individuals. And I can tell you, like, we have a 96% rate of people saying it's the most life-changing experience of their life. And what I've been witness to and what I've had the blessing of being able to hold people through is their version of this too. Yeah. So my healing journey started back then, it continues now, and it also cascades into the healing that I get to be in support of for so many people.
Is your mom still with us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. She actually came to a retreat last year, and through psilocybin, she was able to kick 25 years of depression. She was on antidepressants for 25 years, and no longer takes them.
When you come to a realization like the one you had from 4 years old, did you feel like you needed to talk to your mom about it at all? Or were you able to process it in, out, and through without going back to that?
First, I'll share my what happened for me, and then I'll share what often happens for people. Yeah. For me, I told my mom. She initially met it with criticism and some anger, which I don't fault her for, because underneath that anger was a lot of guilt. I'm sure she blamed herself for that, even though that's not at all her fault. And I think that also triggered something in her, because my belief is that this runs through our family. It's ancestral, as is often the case with any kind of trauma people have. I went through a process of integrating this, but where it began, which was really interesting, a lot of people think like, oh, you come to a realization like this has got to mess you up all sorts of ways. Or man, how come you're not so pissed off at that guy who is still alive? It's because as soon as I realized it, I experienced an extraordinary amount of gratitude. And I was so grateful because the mere knowledge of it filled in the gaps of who I am, the understanding of who I am. And so we like to say, like, all love begins with self-love. And it's really easy to go to quote unquote healers and they're just like, just love yourself, bro. And you're like, but how? and really where love begins, and again, this is I think something else that many spiritual traditions agree with, is where love begins is through the experience of the present moment, of like being here, what Ram Dass calls being here now, and experiencing this now in all of its infinite depth and glory. And because I was experiencing that moment now in the jungle and experiencing myself in such capacity and so much more understanding, I was filled with gratitude at everything that ever happened in my life to lead me to that moment of revelation, including all the stumbles, including all the falls, including all the betrayals, including all the hurt. Like, all of it led me to who I was at that moment. And all of it led me to who I am right in this moment, talking to you now. What happens for a lot of people is they go through a process of integration. Integration, we say, is like the most important part of this work, because you can have this extraordinary helicopter ride to the mountaintop consciousness, but if you come back to life and you're still an asshole, what's it all for, right? And so where integration happens is that's where the rubber meets the road. Like, how do we bring this insight, the felt sense of what many people describe as enlightenment, or deep amounts of peace and love and harmony? How do we bring that back to life, where we're, on Zoom calls or working on a cubicle, or, having deadlines and whatnot, or sitting in traffic? Like, how do we embody that? And that's a process. And that's why there's such an extraordinary difference between doing psychedelic work or doing transformational work. It doesn't have to be with psychedelics. Attempting to do that by oneself versus having some level of guidance through the process, and curriculum and structure. Because this stuff is hard. We're not just rewiring our own neural pathways, we're remapping generations of patterning that we've gotten from our parents and their parents and their parents' parents,
And I think ceremony is integral to that because it puts a sacredness around it. It gives it a gravitas. I did a cacao ceremony a few months back, and it came up at the beginning of the ceremony that it was going to be about mother wound. And I too believe that ancestral trauma, especially through the lineage of the mother, is very much a thing. And it was an incredible experience. It all day long. I didn't know how long it was going to take. I went in with zero expectation. Got there about 3:00, ended up leaving around midnight. It was just me and the facilitator. And it was so powerful. And I felt so released from a lot of, I came to some realizations. I felt very released. And weirdly, the next day my mom called. She and I have historically, a tenuous relationship and such. But she called me the next day, and it was like she was a totally different person with me. And I thought, is it because I'm different? Or did that work travel through this? See, this gives me shivers. Did it travel? And I know it sounds woo-woo and all of that, but that it traveled through my DNA. And because I'm of her and she's of her mother and all that, did it go on through the whole lineage? Which I'd love to think it did. So powerful.
Yeah. We're still trying to understand what's happening here. I was just on Richard Branson's island for his first psychedelic summit, and it was gathered scientists, advocates, funders, and then Ceremonia. We're now one of the leading institutions in the US. We represented facilitators. And so lots of presentations on the science, the neuroreceptors that are hit, critical periods of learning, how it works with addiction, so on and so forth. And then the advocates talking about getting access to veterans and whatnot. But what is often missed in the conversation, with the very kind of left brain approach, is this mystical spiritual domain that we have no idea what's actually happening, And part of the reason why it's missed is because often when you engage in that kind of conversation, the void starts getting filled with a bunch of dogma and beliefs. And ultimately, like what we're, trying to do here at Ceremonia is provide you the framework so that you can discover your own belief, your own truth, what feels right for you. So as an example, one of the aims that we have to get people to feel is the feeling of self-empowerment. We always tell people before a ceremony, you can ask us questions, you can try to talk to us, but by and large, our answer is going to be only you know. So one time I went to the bathroom, in our retreat center, you have to go up some stairs to go to the bathroom. When I open the door and come out of it, right in front of me is one of the participants. His name is Eric. And Eric looks at me, he's like, Austin, should I go to the bathroom? Now, this guy, got up off his mat, walked a distance, which probably felt like an eternity to him, climbed a little stairs, and is standing in front of the restroom door, right? And so every part of me wanted to say, well, of course, you made this whole trip all the way here. Obviously, you came here to use the bathroom, right? But instead, I said to him, Eric, only you know. And he looked at me, he's like, yeah, you're right. I do know. Now, the next day during our integration circle, which is a circle where we share our experience, he would then share that that was the most important experience of his life, because all his life, people have been telling him what to do, and he would listen to it. But in that moment, what really hit him is that he has the inner gnosis to intuit where he's going and what he wants to be in his life at any given moment. And there's a saying that I love: sometimes my intuition leads me wrong, but it's the only thing that's ever led me right. You ask the question, like, what is this really happening? I'd like to think that my family member has had some ancestral message that has come through. Who knows? But only you know.
Well, and I love the idea that it matters and it doesn't matter. That's very Ram Dass. It's that this is the thing that's so frustrating about religion to me, is that whatever is good for a particular person, that's great. If that's working for you, that's wonderful. That doesn't mean it has to work for me. And we do walk a path that is so connected and yet so individualized. It can be confusing, obviously. That's why I chuckled so hard when you said, what the heck's going on? Nobody knows. And there's a beauty in that unknowing. I'm also often, I'm curious your thoughts on this, perplexed by those who are as afraid of their own joy as they are of their anger.
What's that saying? It's like the devil that you know is often easier than the...
Yeah.
What is it?
It's the devil you know is better than the one you don't. In other words, if you live in such comfort of the knowing, even if it's terrible for you.
Exactly. So one of the first things that we ask when people come into our coaching container is, are you ready to approach this with a change mindset or a fixed mindset? Because if you're here to make a change in your life, that means that you have to be ready to question the things that your patterns, right? Your default that you've done. And we liken it to, scientists often use this metaphor that if you're skiing down a hill and you keep skiing down the same tracks, it makes it pretty difficult to veer off that track. But imagine fresh powder for those skiers out there. It's beautiful because you can carve new tracks. What happens within the psychedelic experience is that the mind opens up its pathways that you can carve new neural pathways. So that if your brain would go from point A to point B to point C to point D, now maybe it can go from point A to point D, or D to G, or G to Z, And so you can retrain and rewire your brain literally to remap how you would experience joy or anger. We had another participant, Christina, who came, and in the first ceremony, she was walking to the bathroom and I was following her, and then she collapsed and I caught her. Okay. And her whole body was limp, kind of like Gumby. But she was still very cute and sweet and said, "Oh, I'm totally fine. I'm fine." She's obviously not. Pretty much dead weight as I propped her up. Second ceremony, something very similar. Also collapsed. Now, Christina originally came because she had been in and out of the hospital for digestive issues. There was this big curiosity of what's going on here? Then we did a workshop where, and not to give it away to all your listeners, but we did a workshop called Reparenting, where the workshop is two people holding each other to gentle music for 15 minutes, role playing being the divine parent and the divine child. In other words, what would it be like if you just allowed yourself to be held by your parent? It often produces a lot of tears. We're talking about this cognitively, but in the moment, it's an incredible experience because how often have we allowed ourselves to just be held for 15 minutes straight? Try this at home with your partner, by the way. It's an amazing experience. After that, she realized, I asked the question, when do you feel the most safe as a kid? And she realized that when she felt the most safe was when she was sick, because at that moment, that's when her mom would take care of her. And so her body it clicked for her. Her body learned to get sick in order to feel love and safety. So when she would feel unsafe, immediately, let's get sick. Third ceremony, she was vibrant, dancing, singing. And ever since, those physical ailments have largely gone away. To your point, many people can have a discomfort with certain feelings of joy or peace or love because they're like, what is this feeling? But what's even deeper than that is our body keeps the score. Our body stores the experience of what's familiar to us. And it can store decades of stress. It could store generations of pain, trauma, of blame, of shame. Psychedelics doesn't have to be the answer, but in my opinion, it is the best answer that we have right now for an accelerated path of healing.
When you work in these spaces and hold that kind of energy, how do you decompress from it? How do you cleanse yourself from it? And also, you mentioned the savior complex? How do you keep in a detached way, especially when such huge things are happening all around you? How do you keep your ego from going, yeah, I did that, I was with Richard Branson, I'm cool. How do you detach from that space?
Well, first I'll say I'm still learning on both those subject matters, detaching and also the ego. I'll be the first to admit that pride has been my biggest shadow. Coincidentally, it's a little bit of a tangent. Pride exists to hide shame, aka shame being the parts of us that carry the burdens of I'm not enough or I'm not good enough, right? And so I'll inflate my chest and be like, no, I'm actually amazing. But that's just an aside. I like being nerdy about psychology.
No, that's a very good point, I think, to make.
I'll target the first part of your question, like how do I decompress and I'll re-articulate it. Like how do I make sure I'm not taking on too much? And I learned something from Dr. Thupten Jinpa, who's the translator to the Dalai Lama and a prominent Buddhist monk himself. And he has something in San Francisco called the Compassion Institute. Through a combination of speaking with him and speaking with Dr. Richard Schwartz, who created Internal Family Systems, the fastest growing psychotherapeutic framework now, and the one most often paired with psychedelic assisted therapy, this idea of compassion versus empathy. Empathy is if you're crying, Susan, I am crying with you. I am feeling your feelings as you, with you, and I'm in it with you. I used to lead every interaction that way. And I was good at it. I was good at feeling other people's feelings. And I would then pat myself on the back and be like, damn, I did a good job by really feeling your feelings. But then I would get so drained that I would barely be able to walk after a retreat. Like I was exhausted. And then I learned from Dr. Jinpa and from Dr. Schwartz that empathy is a protective part. It's actually a part that tries to protect me from feeling myself, which is very interesting because the more that I feel you, the less I'm able to feel myself, which is the impact that you're having on me. And whereas empathy is a protective part that is energy depleted, energy subtractive, compassion is an aspect of self with a capital S. This is under the IFS model, which is infinitely available. And so you would look at, there's the story of the Dalai Lama. He was at a conference. It was at this hotel over the course of 3 days, right? And he was the featured speaker. Thousands of people attend and they listen to the Dalai Lama speak. And afterwards, the Dalai Lama goes to his assistant and says, please gather all the staff of the hotel. The 150 staff line up in front of him. And one by one, he greets every person and asks how their day is, and expresses gratitude to them. This takes hours. And every single person had his complete and full attention. As if at that moment, that person was the most important person in the world to him. And then he gets on a plane and he goes to the next talk. And so you might ask yourself, like, how is it possible that someone of that age has that much energy? And it's because the amount of compassion that he has, the amount of compassion that Dr. Schwartz has, is so available. It's so expansive that it's actually energy additive. They can have less sleep and have more energy than most people. I use that as inspiration to discover that well of compassion inside of me. And now the way that I hold the container is if you are deeply crying, I'm not crying with you. I am being very present with you and breathing with you. And I am pouring my compassion into your experience. Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a prominent Buddhist monk.
I was just going to say, this sounds very Thich Nhat Hanh.
Yeah. He wrote about 118 books, passed away something like 2 years ago. And I love his definition of compassion. He says, it's the want for someone else not to suffer. I've been in spaces where I've seen the deepest amount of pain, like humanly imaginable, combat veterans or people that have suffered tremendous abuses. And they're reliving it in front of me, just like I relived my experience. And I'm able now, finally, like it took me a long time to develop the skill and I'm still learning this, but to be able to sit there and just give them my presence and my compassion without, being in it with them. Does that make sense?
It does. It feels like the difference between going into someone's space and holding space for them.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of times, like if you see your friend crying, what's the typical thing that most people do? They're like, oh, put a hand on your shoulder and, oh, it's okay. Don't cry. It's going to be okay. As facilitators, part of our training is to ask, why am I doing that? Why am I putting my hand on someone's shoulder? And the real answer, 99 times out of 100, is it's not for them, it's for me. Or my ego tries to convince me that it's for them. Because in that moment, there's some part of me that is uncomfortable with them crying, that doesn't want them to cry. But have you ever had a really good sob? After that really good sob, how do you feel?
Awesome.
Awesome. Exactly. The reason why you feel that way is because that sob has been locked up inside of you for God knows how long. And now it's finally allowed to release. And so if I put a hand on your shoulder as you're crying and say, oh, you don't need to cry, it's going to be okay, and then you stop crying, I may have just robbed you of that experience of being able to release something that's been trapped for a very long period of time. And I did that not for you, I did it for me.
This is why it's such a problem that boys are told they're not supposed to cry.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love crying. I'm a good crier. But I used to suck at it before because I was a man.
Yes, right. I've been to various energy working scenarios where the facilitator stepped back as I would call it a primal cry, and boy, it feels like hundreds of pounds are lifted and hundreds of years are lifted when you come out of something like that. It's such a release.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. But I mean, this is my argument for saying this is why we go to the movies or read a book or listen to music, because sometimes we don't know how to get to those spaces, and they are our conduit into that release. And in our brain, we're like, oh, no, I'm just crying about the movie. But what you're actually doing is you're feeling that mirrored experience, and it allows you to make that release. I'm a huge believer in being emotional in those spaces because I think it does the work.
Yes, and I also have opinions in that sometimes we go and seek it out, and we seek it out of a form of masochism, like we want to feel the pain.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of confusion as love and fear / hate, how those two things, what they feel like, and especially with parent wounds, when you grow up thinking, when those two things get so convoluted as to the meaning of them, and then you seek them out in other relationships and all hell breaks loose. That's certainly not an uncommon thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Tell me about what steps led to creating the facility. And I think a lot of people would be like, well, why aren't you supposed to go off and be in a jungle to do this versus going to Colorado, which, by the way, is a beautiful state.
Yeah. Prior to founding Ceremonia in 2022, I was the director of one of the most well-known ayahuasca retreats in the world, based in Costa Rica, called One Heart. Through One Heart, I was part of around 300 individuals' journeys, mostly founders and entrepreneurs. What I observed in that experience, like, they produce an extraordinarily beautiful experience. I will forever be grateful to them. Extraordinarily curated, well-intentioned, really best in its class at what it does. And it was missing something tremendous. And the way that I discovered that it was missing is because despite doing ayahuasca dozens of times myself, despite being deeply in service, despite devoting a lot of energy of my own to that path, I was suffering in ways that I did not understand how to get out of. And I didn't even know what to look for in terms of support on how to get out of it myself. And I'm a pretty smart dude. So, for me to have spent that much time and energy in a container that professes to provide, deep and long-term healing, that I was still clueless as to what to do to get out of these very painful things that were happening in my life. Well, I went on a path of self-discovery. And what I figured out was that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are previous maps to this, and they come from mindfulness and psychology. I have a podcast. It's called Modern Enlightenment. and we have the luminaries from the psychedelic and spiritual space coming onto our podcast. And before the podcast, I explained to them what this podcast is about. And I say to them, 100 years ago, if you wanted to pursue the path of spiritual enlightenment, you'd have to become a horny monk on a mountaintop. But now we have all these different tools. We've got breath work, we've got neuroscience, we've got psychedelics, we've got so on and so forth, retreats, blah, 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 right? So how do we get to enlightenment, right? What's the optimal pathway there? Because what ends up happening is psychedelics is just an accelerant. It's a catalyst. When Maharaji, which is Ram Dass's teacher, or Ram Dass's guru, when Ram Dass gave him 5 hits of acid, of LSD, Maharaji was like, that's interesting. Give me 5 more. So now, Dr. Richard Alpert, aka Ram Dass, gives him another 5. This Maharaji is now on 10 doses of LSD, which is exponential. And then he says, this is a plaything. In other words, what Maharaji's waking life, what he was experiencing in his waking life, was more than 10 tabs of LSD. And really, in fact, probably more than LSD could possibly even get a person to. In other words, the path of meditation and mindfulness already has a map for where we're trying to get to within the psychedelic space. So that's data point number 1. Data point number 2 is psychotherapy. Psychotherapy, we're now in the 3rd stage of psychology. First stage was Pavlov, ring a bell, dog salivates, human must be the same way. Second was cognitive behavioral therapy, which is CBT, which is I'm going to say affirmations and I'm going to be able to change my mood, largely disproven. And now the third wave is a more integrated model. It began with a form of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, which was a psychotherapeutic or clinical model of mindfulness. And so now we have Gestalt, IFS, EMDR, like lots of different forms of therapy in this third wave that are effectively saying the way to healing is the experience of the present moment. We all have trauma with a lowercase t or a capital T. We all have stuff in the past. We all have anxiety or fears of the future. But what really matters is how do you experience it now? Because now is the only time it exists. You feel anxious about what you're going to do in your retirement or your wedding next week. Well, you're actually experiencing that anxiety right now in this moment. How can you be with that experience with greater mindfulness and skillfulness? So I started to learn these tools. And the way that I learned it would be I would meet somebody with an embodiment of something that I would want. It's like, wow, you are so much more peaceful. You're so much more present, compassionate, sensual, tantric, whatever it was. I was like, how did you get that way? And they said, well, go and try this thing. So at that time, my partner and I would go to a training or retreat almost once a month, all over the world. Right? We had the freedom and both in time and money to be able to do that. And it very rapidly learned a huge tool set of not just theoretical ideas, but really embodied sense of how to work with these things. And I took the best of the best of these workshops from various different programs, stitched it together, iterated on it, and now that's what Ceremonia is. We've run now 36 retreats in 2 years, a little over 2 years, which is an incredible amount of retreats. And every single one is different from the last because we still keep iterating, improving on this model. And the model is effectively the same path I took, just more compressed. The idea is you come here to learn skills, the skills of being with your own experience of self in the present moment, aka self-empowerment, and being with the other, like in a community, aka connection. You practice these skills in workshops and you grow your capacity to meet your experience so that when you go into the psychedelic, something that would normally trigger you, let's say a trauma with a capital T comes up. Let's say you're a combat veteran and you're reliving an experience of your friend dying in front of you, which we've had. Instead of fight, flight, or freezing in that moment, you now have the skills and the capacity to meet it with greater fullness. And then boom, what that does is instead of what would normally become a bad trip, now has the opportunity to become fuel for your transformation or your deeper understanding of yourself. But here's the kicker. Here's the best part. while that experience is valuable, the most valuable thing is that you did it and that you know how to do it, because you're going to go home to life and life is going to continue to life. Buddhism says everything that you love, you will lose. We will lose our parents. We will lose our loved ones. We will lose our pets. We'll lose our jobs. We will lose it all to time. And so how do we prepare ourselves for the continuation of life and its inevitable loss? The way that we do that is through the same mechanism, through skills and capacity, through mindfulness and skillfulness. And so by practicing this on ourselves in a psychedelic, we're able to then translate that into the 3D world and integrate that into our life.
I mean, I spent a lot of high school on LSD, but it obliterates the guards at the gate, which is also helpful when you're trying to get into those spaces. How do you know when people come to you which pathway is the pathway, whether it's psilocybin or ayahuasca? Because those are two totally different beings.
Totally. Well, I'm going to first answer more generally and then that specific question. How do we know what pathway is the right pathway? What I've discovered is no matter if you're a starving artist or you are a billionaire, and we've had those two kinds of people in the very same circle, everything funnels to the same place, which is this question: do you love yourself? Can you be with what is? Be with this experience of now. Now, as to the question of psilocybin versus ayahuasca, we get asked this a lot. We have different levels in Ceremonia. Our level 1 is with psilocybin, our level 2 is with ayahuasca. And the reason why that's the case is because ayahuasca is typically held in a very shamanic container. So for you to become an ayahuasquero, at least one that I might recommend to somebody, would require you to go train in the jungle, drinking ayahuasca a few times a week for years, and then apprentice for years in ceremonies. And then finally you can serve medicine. So to become ayahuasquero is a lot more than getting a PhD in any subject matter. The benefit of that is that you're getting, when you sit with ayahuasca, assuming that the shaman or the facilitator is a good one. And by the way, I know like hundreds of facilitators. I only trust 6 of them. And they're the ones that serve medicine here. But when you're sitting with someone, you're getting their lineage, the oral traditions and their training that's been passed on through thousands of years. There's a lot of beauty in that, but there's also baggage in that because it includes dogma, includes their beliefs. So I often say to people, one way to discern whether a facilitator is spiritually safe for you is to challenge their beliefs. You ask them, what do you believe in? And then their follow-up question is, how do you know that to be true? And if they get triggered, please run away, because it's very likely that they're not going to create the room for you to discover your own beliefs. So when you're in a container where the facilitator is carrying their own baggage and serving you medicine, it's really important that you as a participant have enough skillfulness and mindfulness, right? AKA the training that we provide off the medicine, for you to be able to discern what is true for you. In other words, if you have an experience, the mind attempts to make meaning out of that experience, attempts to put form into that meaning. So one of our alumni is the president of Unity Church, a mega church in the U.S., a mega Christian church, right? So he has an experience, and he experiences Christ consciousness. We had someone else who's Muslim. He has an experience, and he experienced Allah. We have someone who's atheist that comes in. He has an experience, and he has something that he can only call spirituality. My point is, it's with ayahuasca, it's more challenging for you to discern what is yours because of the impression from the outside, from the shamanic history and container. With psilocybin, the kind of training, we're one of a few centers in Colorado pre-approved to train and license facilitators here under Colorado state law. And so our training program is 9 months long, and then you can serve medicine. In a perfect world, I would make that much longer, but of course, accessibility and so on and so forth. The point is, people can have the level of training from the get-go to be able to make room for everyone else's beliefs more easily with psilocybin. Psilocybin versus ayahuasca, I would say I advocate for doing psilocybin first with quote-unquote training so that you can, have the tools to support you. And then ayahuasca after that, because it's an absolutely beautiful medicine that is my teacher. I just would caution people to do ayahuasca right off the bat because it's so easy for the mind to assign the healing agent to something outside of themselves. Oh, it's the shaman healing me. It's the music healing me. It's the medicine or the plant spirit healing me. The danger of that is when you go home, that same process can be ingrained. And so now suddenly when life continues to life, you're like, damn, where's my shaman? Or I need to drink ayahuasca. Or the flip side of the coin is victimhood. Oh, it's something outside of me that's causing me to feel this way. Mercury's in retrograde, therefore that's why I'm an asshole.
Right.
Yeah. So everything that we're doing is aimed towards people feeling their own power.
How does Austin, the man, live a life outside of Austin, the facilitator and the person who is present and in it, not of it? Do you have an ability to detach even from the detachment, to just, chill out, eat popcorn and watch a movie in your own life? Not literally, but that metaphorically speaking.
Yeah, totally. I don't preach from a pulpit. I'm human and I do human things. Yesterday, I was at a party at my friend's bar and I go to Burning Man and I date and I'm of course a man and I'm still on my path too. A really big part of this work, in my opinion, is to bring the fullness of our own being, even as facilitators, into the container so that we can model vulnerability and authenticity. As long as that we got you, aka we got our shit together enough that we got you. I think that's as long as there's that, then I advocate for all of our facilitators to bring everything in, just as we would expect or advocate for the participants to do themselves.
May I ask your dad's name? I like to say the names of the people who have passed so that they have their immortality intact.
Yeah, his name was Jeff.
Jeff. Hi, Jeff.
Yeah.
What do you see moving forward for your work? Is there room for expansion in this kind of work when you know that these tools at your disposal are so powerful? I mean, I think working with veterans and people with PTSD and survivors, how do you grow without growing too big? How does it not become a caricature of itself? You know what I mean?
We're an extraordinarily unique organization. Most places, if you were to go, let's say ceremony, you come in, you shake hands with a group of people, 2 hours later, you're tripping together. The upside is that can be pretty inexpensive. Like in Denver, you can find a ceremony for $250 a night. And then you go home at that night or you sleep on your mat that night, right? The downside is that you're effectively doing spiritual and psychological surgery on yourself. And what is so important in that case is how safe do you feel? There's a sharp limit to how safe you can possibly feel doing things with strangers that you haven't met or talked to. And so, what we do here is, in addition to the mindfulness and skillfulness, the training that I shared with you, is we build connection and we build community. We gather every Sunday in perpetuity as a community, all our alumni, and we get anywhere between 10 and 50 people at a time that come and we practice our tools. We practice being in community and relationship with each other. What's really important to me, my goal, is that this model that we've created to provide some level of training and then provide community for people that are undergoing this transformational process, this model doesn't stay unique to us, that it is widely available and is the standard for the field at large. And so, I'm part of the legislative process in Colorado. We're one of the few centers that will license people. And, my goal is to teach people this model and eventually open source this model so that facilitators of the future can know that there is something available that provides deep and durable healing beyond what we as facilitators can provide one-on-one. And that's through tools, that's through peer support, that's through community. There's a limit to how much I can help people. I still get messages from people telling me their challenges and whatnot. And I can't save everybody anymore. That's what I tried to do with my mom and the women in my life. And so, my goal here now is to spread this model.
Do you have scholarship for people that can't afford maybe to attend?
Absolutely. And what I would say is, go on our website, ceremoniacircle.org, sign up for a breakthrough call. We might move to webinar format soon, and have the conversation. And we do what we can to support you through a combination of scholarship and payment plans. We're also about to release a microdosing course called Awaken at Home, where it's a more elongated program, right? A 3-month program where you're learning the tools and you're microdosing and going through a coaching container. So there's lots of options that we're going to make available.
I'm assuming those things are done on Zoom or some sort of a video conferencing, as well as the check-in you were talking about of community.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
God bless Zoom. It's made the world smaller. Austin, I really appreciate your time. This all is fascinating and something that I personally am incredibly interested in. My hope, regardless of how people find their way to themselves, that this will be a continual process for humanity. We desperately need it. And I know it's scary, but it's my hope.
Thank you so much, Susan. This was beautiful. And thank you for sharing your gifts to the world. And would love to have you in one of our retreats. Let's set that up.
Oh, absolutely. I've already, before even when I got your information and I was said, absolutely, I would love to talk to Austin. And then I started looking at the website and I've been sending it out to people like crazy. I wish my parents would do something like this. But again, I know that these are the types of things that it will do no good unless you're ready. And you never know what might happen, for sure. I mean, that's the beauty of life. But I never thought I would do a cacao ceremony. I thought, wait, I drink hot chocolate? What do you mean? And it was so powerful. But I might not have been in a place where I could have accepted that kind of medicine if I had done it any other time. You just never know when those doors open. And then the walking through it is a whole other process.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Thank you for listening, everybody. Thanks, Austin.
Thank you, Susan.
Rate, review, and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks. Bye.